I'm going to ask my colleagues who are here to take seats, and for those who are, we want to first of all thank the Ways and Means Committee for their allowing us to do this palatial committee hearing room. We also want to move rapidly because they're going to call votes real soon, so we want to get this thing started so we can get back here and get to the meat and potatoes of the hearing. So if we get the door closed too on the left there, can we get, I don't know where's, and then I'll call the hearing to order and recognize myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning and welcome to today's hearing to examine funding, budgetary, and scoring issues associated with efforts to manage and dispose of our nation's spent nuclear fuel and high-level radioactive waste. As Congress deals with the year-end budget issues, today's testimony is timely. This subcommittee is continuing to examine specific challenges managing used fuel and national defense waste. Central to this discussion is providing adequate financial resources for a multi-generational repository program. In 1982, Congress passed the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, deciding commercial nuclear fuel consumers would fund permanent disposal of spent nuclear fuel through a 1 mil per kilowatt-hour tax on nuclear-generated electricity to be paid into the Nuclear Waste Fund and managed by the Department of Energy. A DOE audit of the fund released just this morning projects its total current value is $334.3 billion, an increase of $1.4 billion over last year, and an $11 billion increase since 2009. This includes consumer payments plus an interest calculation. Since the fee was instituted over 30 years ago, ratepayers in my home state of Illinois have contributed more than any other state at over $2.3 billion to the Nuclear Waste Fund. And I've paid some of that personally myself. The repository program was designed to be a multi-generational effort which required long-term stability so funding would be available at the most critical times of the program. The 1982 outlook for nuclear power was more optimistic than today's. That means a shrinking fleet of operating reactors must provide adequate financial resources for a 100-year program. Meanwhile, the budgetary and scoring treatment of the Nuclear Waste Fund is broken. Comprehensive budget reconciliation measures enacted after the 1982 counted revenues from the fee as reducing the budget deficit in the fiscal year they were paid. Yet programmatic outlays remained on the discretionary side of the budget ledger and counts against annual budget caps. That means spending on the repository competes every year with other federal budget priorities, such as maintaining our nuclear defense capability or building Army Corps water projects. Today, we will get a better perspective as to how and why these budget changes have complicated the program to permanently dispose of used fuel. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act required the federal government to begin accepting fuel from commercial power plants by 1998, and DOE entered into contracts with plant operators to do just that. But DOE was not ready in 1998. As a result, commercial utilities started suing DOE for breach of contract, and the court sided with utilities. The damage payments are drawn from a permanent, indefinite appropriation known as the Judgment Fund. Payments from the Judgment Fund don't count against total spending caps, so policymakers have little incentive to stop the bleeding. 3 weeks ago, DOE updated its annual cost estimate of liability for failure to fulfill its obligations as required by the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, which will ultimately all be paid from the Judgment Fund. DOE estimates lifetime liability to reach $23.7 billion. This is a $1 billion increase over last year, and a $10 billion or 50% increase since President Obama shuttered the Yucca Mountain project. In 2014, the federal government paid out over $900 million from the Judgment Fund while not appropriating any money from the Nuclear Waste Fund for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and DOE to work on the Yucca Mountain license application. That annual legal payment is nearly 3 times as much funding as the total amount the NRC needs to complete its review of the Yucca license. DOE's projection is predicated on the ability to begin taking title of commercial spent nuclear fuel in 5 years. Recently, the subcommittee received testimony it would take at least 7 to 9 years to just begin transporting used fuel, regardless when a site is available. It is likely the liability will continue to skyrocket until we get the stalled program back on track. Budgetary and funding challenges have been further complicated by President Obama's legally dubious decision to walk away from Yucca Mountain. When DOE stopped work on the repository program, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners filed suit to halt collection of nuclear waste fee. The courts found DOE's required financial projections absolutely useless, and based on pie-in-the-sky analysis, the decision stated the government's argument was flatly unreasonable and obviously disingenuous. The court directed DOE to halt the annual collection of $750 million from ratepayers, but the payments by taxpayers for DOE's breach of contract continued. I look forward to hearing from NARUC today about their experience with the Nuclear Waste Fund. I welcome all our witnesses and urge my colleagues to take advantage of their expertise as we prepare to sort this out and hopefully in the future fix it. Thank you, and I yield to Mr. Tonko for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Shimkus, and good morning to our panelists. Thank you all for being here on what has become a very busy week. We all know the politics behind nuclear waste disposal are complicated, so it should come as no surprise that the budgetary and legislative histories are equally complex. In 1982, Congress passed its Nuclear Waste Policy Act, directing the Department of Energy to remove spent nuclear fuel from commercial nuclear power plants in exchange for certain fees and transport it to a permanent geologic repository beginning no later than January 31st, 1998. Obviously, that deadline has been missed. Utilities that generate nuclear waste had been paying an ongoing fee of 1 mil per kilowatt hour of nuclear-generated electricity. These fees were deposited in the Nuclear Waste Fund to cover the cost of the Department of Energy's acceptance, transport, and disposal of civilian nuclear waste. But the fund has not worked as intended. I am sure we will get into the recent history and options moving forward later in this hearing. More than 60 years after beginning and expanding our use of nuclear materials, nuclear waste disposal remains a difficult and an expensive problem. we will have to deal with the 74,000 metric tons of commercial spent fuel, with more being added each and every year. And I agree that we should be looking at all options for nuclear waste disposal in an effort to find the safest and the most cost-effective ways for us as a nation to move forward. But we must recognize and deal with both the technical and the political challenges of disposing of all classes of nuclear waste. During this Congress, this subcommittee has examined a variety of nuclear waste disposal issues. I'm glad we're able to continue that work today. I thank you all again for your participation in this morning's activities. I look forward to your testimony and further discussion of what is a very important issue. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back his time. The chair looks to the majority side. No one seeking recognition. Anyone on the minority side? Seeing none. We want to thank my colleagues for moving expeditiously, and now welcome our witnesses. And we are going to, your full statements into the record. We'll ask you to speak for 5 minutes, and we'll hopefully get to questions and answers. So I'll introduce you one at a time. First, it'll be Mr. David Bearden, who's appeared before the subcommittee numerous times, or the committee as a whole, specialist in environmental policy for the Congressional Research Service. Welcome, and you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tonko, and members of the subcommittee, my name is David Bearden. I'm a specialist in environmental policy for the Congressional Research Service, called CRS. Thank you for inviting me to testify on behalf of the agency. In serving the U.S. Congress on a nonpartisan and objective basis, CRS takes no position on any of the issues examined today. CRS has been asked by the subcommittee to outline the budgetary framework for the management of the Nuclear Waste Fund. CRS also maintains a team of policy analysts and legislative attorneys who have prepared reports on an array of complex issues associated with the Nuclear Waste Fund, and so we remain available to assist the subcommittee and the full committee with broader issues than addressed in my testimony today. In terms of the statutory framework, as the chairman mentioned at the beginning in his opening remarks, Section 302 of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982 established the Nuclear Waste Fund, financed primarily with the collection of fees from civilian nuclear utilities to fund the permanent disposal of their spent or used nuclear fuel and related wastes. As amended, the statute authorizes the Department of Energy, DOE, to develop a deep geologic repository for the disposal of these wastes, subject to licensing by the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The development of a repository and the selection of Yucca Mountain in Nevada for its location have been the subject of various scientific, technical, regulatory, budgetary, legal, and policy debates. The lack of a repository to accept spent or used nuclear fuel has been an ongoing issue. Nuclear utilities have paid fees to finance the Nuclear Waste Fund and entered contracts with the federal government for the disposal of their spent or used nuclear fuel by the statutory deadline of January 31st, 1998. Appropriations Acts have made monies from the fund available to DOE and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to support the licensing process, but construction of a repository could not begin until NRC approves the license pursuant to the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. Nuclear utilities have filed damage claims against DOE for partial breach of existing contracts to cover their spent or used nuclear fuel storage costs in the interim, while a repository has been unavailable since the statutory deadline lapsed. The Nuclear Waste Fund is not explicitly authorized to pay damage claims, so the judgment fund of the U.S. Treasury, therefore, has been the source of federal funds for the payment of eligible claims. DOE has reported that a total of $5.3 billion in eligible claims have been paid from the judgment fund as of the end of fiscal year 2015. Now I'll just briefly outline the basic budgetary framework of the fund itself and existing law. As authorized in the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, receipts from the nuclear utility fee collections are deposited in the fiscal year they're collected into the U.S. Treasury and credited to the Nuclear Waste Fund as assets available for discretionary appropriations. The receipts are not treated as a revenue or offsetting collections for discretionary spending, though. They're treated as negative direct spending that has the effect of reducing total federal direct spending in the fiscal year in which the receipts are collected. The accumulated balance of past collections does not continue to count as a reduction to direct spending in future fiscal years, though, as it would result in the double counting of receipts. The unappropriated balance of the Nuclear Waste Fund is invested in U.S. Treasury securities that accrue interest credited to the fund that contributes to the total balance available for discretionary appropriation. The assets credited to the Nuclear Waste Fund from the nuclear utility fee collections are a liability to the general fund of the U.S. Treasury to provide these assets once discretionary appropriations are enacted. Regardless of the accumulated balance, though, appropriations from the fund remain subject to limitations on annual discretionary spending. And this framework for the fund is not unique within the federal budget, though. Some other examples include the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, the Hazardous Substance Superfund Trust Fund, Leaking Underground Storage Tank Trust Fund, and the Uranium Enrichment, Decontamination, and Decommissioning Fund. And in its department-wide financial report for fiscal year 2015, DOE reported a balance in the Nuclear Waste Fund of $34.3 billion in net investments and related interests combined, and those investments refer to the fee collections. There have been no new receipts credited to the fund from nuclear utility fees since the suspension of the collections on May 16, 2014, as a result of litigation challenging the present need for the fees. However, interest has continued to accrue, increasing the balance each year. So under current law and existing budgetary procedural requirements, the unappropriated balance of the Nuclear Waste Fund does remain available for appropriation to carry out the purposes of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, but it's subject to applicable limitations on federal spending. The budgetary treatment of the receipts does not permit past collections to be applied as an offset to future spending, but other potential budgetary options may be dependent upon amendments or exceptions to current law or existing procedures. So that concludes the remarks of my prepared statement. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the subcommittee today, and I will be happy to address any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. We look forward to answering questions because that was very confusing. We'd like to turn to Mr. Cawley, Chief of Natural and Physical Resources Cost Estimate Unit of the Congressional Budget Office. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to present CBO's review of the status of the Nuclear Waste Fund and to try to explain the budgetary treatment of the fund. I think if we look back over the last 33 years, about $22 billion has been collected from nuclear power ratepayers, and about 1/3 of that has been spent on the waste disposal system. 5 years ago, the administration found that developing the Yucca Mountain site for the disposal of waste was unworkable, and there has been no significant spending on the site project in recent years. Last year, as a result of a federal court order, the department stopped collecting the nuclear waste fee from electricity ratepayers. Those fees had amounted to about $750 million a year, and they were stopped because the court found the department could not demonstrate whether the fee collections were too small or too large relative to the expected life cycle cost of the program. Although the government's not collecting the waste fee and is not spending any of the previous fee collections, the government is incurring another type of cost. Under the contracts the Department of Energy signed after the '82 Act, we were set to begin accepting waste for disposal 17 years ago. Shortly after the deadline was missed in '98, utilities filed claims and won judgments for a partial breach of the disposal contracts. At this point, the federal taxpayers, through the Treasury's Judgment Fund, have paid over $5 billion to utilities as compensation for the breach. CBO expects that utilities will collect another $5 billion more in compensation in the coming decade. In the simplest terms, today the government's using taxpayer funds to pay for private storage of waste instead of spending ratepayer fees to permanently dispose of the waste as authorized in the '82 Act. I wanted to make a couple of points about the nuclear waste program budget and the enforcement procedures that Congress uses in the congressional budget process. The fund accounts for both the receipt of fees from utilities and amounts provided through the annual appropriations process. In addition, interest is credited and it becomes available to be spent for program purposes. In the congressional budget process, there's a distinction made between mandatory spending that operates under permanent law and discretionary spending that flows from annual appropriations acts. The waste program has one foot in each of these spending categories. The fee collections are part of the mandatory category, and spending on waste disposal activities is in the discretionary category. To control legislative changes to the budget, the Congress established the pay-as-you-go system for mandatory spending, and currently discretionary spending is controlled through a system of caps on total spending. As was mentioned, the split mandatory discretionary treatment for the waste program is not unique in the budget. There are other programs with a similar treatment. In very practical terms, I think the program's budgetary treatment means two things. First, any future appropriations for the waste program will need to compete for funding along with all other discretionary federal programs that are controlled by the caps on spending. The unspent balances in the fund cannot be used unless those amounts are appropriated. The collection of those balances in previous years helped to reduce the deficits in those earlier years, but they have no budgetary effect in future years. Second, if the waste fees are reinstated in the future, they will reduce the deficit, but those mandatory collections cannot be credited to or directly offset the cost of discretionary appropriations for spending on the program. I think that's a good point for me to stop talking about the budget, and I'd be happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you very much. And just for my colleagues, we'll finish the opening statements. They have called votes. We'll go to the floor after the opening statements, and then we'll return for the question period. So last but not least, we'd like to recognize Travis Kavula, Commissioner, Montana Public Service Commission, President of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. Welcome, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Because it's a pleasure, and Ranking Member Tonko, members of the subcommittee, it's a pleasure to be before you today. I am the president of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, which has long been involved in this issue from a policy-making and litigation front. NARUC applauds this subcommittee's tenacity and leadership on these issues. Unlike the previous two speakers, we have a full-throated and unambiguous opinion on this matter as well, which I'll be happy to share with you today. NARUC is a nonprofit organization founded in 1889. Our members are the public utility commissions in all 50 states and U.S. territories. We regulate the retail rates and services of electric, gas, water, and some telecommunications utilities. NARUC and its state commission members were at the table when the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982 was developed and passed. And at that time and today, state regulators agree that users of electricity from nuclear power plants should pay for the federal nuclear waste management and disposal program. And the consumers have paid generously into that fund. Since 1982, more than $40 billion in direct payments and interest have been paid into the nuclear waste fund. And so far, we have very little to show for it, just an $11 billion hole in the ground, to be exact. The federal government missed its statutorily mandated deadline to start accepting nuclear waste in 1998. In the early 1990s and in the late 1990s and early 2000s at least, the program had shown progress, notwithstanding that missed deadline. However, since that time, efforts to block funding for the geologic disposal of nuclear waste at Yucca Mountain, as well as the Department of Energy's unlawful refusal to consider the project's licensing application, has kept the country in the exact same situation we occupied 28 years ago when Congress decided that Yucca Mountain should be the first site considered for the United States Permanent Repository. The repercussions of the administration's failure to take title of nuclear waste and to develop the Yucca Mountain site have been substantial. Now, taxpayers from each of your constituencies, even those whose utilities have no stake in nuclear-generated electricity, continue to fund court-awarded damages from the Department of Justice Judgment Fund for DOE's partial breach of contract. The chairman and ranking member have described very well, I think, the history of some of these problems. So in the interest of cutting it short, I'll move on to a few things NARUC views as solutions. First, access to the billions collected by the Nuclear Waste Fund is essential for any interim or permanent solution to nuclear waste disposal to succeed. Appropriations for the waste disposal program remain under the spending cap applicable to all domestic programs, even though the NWF is self-financed. This forces, as you just heard, spending from the NWF to compete with other spending programs that never have had a dedicated funding stream. This approach is unfair to ratepayers and inappropriate for a fund designed to finance the extremely protracted life cycle of a capital-intensive disposal program. It makes no sense to treat funds collected specifically to support the disposal of used commercial reactor fuel as discretionary. Over the life of the program, this approach has led to lower appropriations than were requested to accomplish this mission. Reduced funding contributed to project and schedule delays. Inadequate funding can only hamper efficient scheduling and planning, thereby driving up costs. The program must have full access to the revenues generated by consumers' fee payments if they resume, as well as to the balance of the NWF. This requires legislative changes to the NWPA. As related above, the U.S. government has not lived up to the promises made under the NWPA and subsequent congressional enactments. This is really not a matter of opinion, but of legal record, and of particular relevance is the decision that the chairman cited from the Circuit Court of Appeals regarding the DOE fee collection. I think this sorry history strongly suggests that the management of federal responsibilities for integrated used fuel should be more successful if they were assigned to a new organization with a single-minded devotion to the cause of permanently storing used fuel. Congress should charter a new federal corporation dedicated solely to implementing the nuclear waste management program and empowered with the authority and resources, including direct access to the NWF outside the current appropriations process that is necessary for such a mission to succeed. Congress would still have oversight over those, but they would be separately dedicated to the use by that organization. If implemented in the near term, these ideas can help create a solid foundation on which to build a viable spent nuclear fuel management program. NARUC is certainly open to the idea of interim solutions where nuclear fuel is stored, but these interim sites cannot be allowed to be mere parking lots in the absence of a permanent storage solution. Thank you very much, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you very much. For my colleagues, there's 7 minutes remaining on the floor to cast our votes, so we will, in a minute, recess. For our panelists, there are 7 votes called. That's a good 45 minutes to an hour. So hang around the building, get coffee, and we'll be back to delve more deeply into this. We thank you for your time. And with that, I'm going to recess the hearing. We'll call the hearing back to order. Again, apologize for the long delay, but we have to do our job, which is voting on the floor also. So we were going to go in. Thank you for the opening statements. We will go into the questions, and I'll begin. I'll recognize myself 5 minutes to start the questioning. The first one is Mr. Cavullo. And I know, Mr. Cavullo, you have to leave. I've been informed. So when you have to go, just get up and go. If we're still questioning, hopefully we'll direct the questions that we can to you early enough to get responses. So hence the first one. At a recent subcommittee hearing to examine issues associated with transportation of nuclear materials, expert witnesses testified that pursuing consolidated interim storage for spent nuclear fuel would likely increase life cycle costs as a result of having to ship material more than once. The last DOE life cycle cost analysis for Yucca Mountain estimated total transportation costs to exceed $20 billion over the associated 70-year national transportation campaign. You stated your concern with the possibility that consolidated interim storage would increase the financial burden on ratepayers without a justifiable return on investment, such as a reduction in payments from the judgment fund. What exactly is necessary to provide assurance that any authorization for consolidated interim storage is in the interest of electric ratepayers?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. I think the answer is that there needs to be unambiguously a cost-benefit analysis done of this. My real concern on behalf of NARUC is that you would establish these consolidated storage sites as an interim solution, but then they would become de facto permanent sites rather than the kind of parking lot that undergirds the concept. So, there needs to be more costing than has already been done. The sites, at least one of the sites that has raised its hand on a consent basis is one in New Mexico, but they've been very clear in that state that they're unwilling to go forward without the designation of a permanent repository. So I would imagine you would have difficulty of the same type you face in the Yucca Mountain issue with even identifying those interim locations. So I think my own personal opinion on this is that you would need to have a clear linkage between the interim site and the permanent site in the same breath, acknowledging that it may be a reasonable idea because realistically we are decades off of creating a permanent repository one way or another.
Thank you very much. Now for Mr. Bearden and Mr. Cawley, in both your testimonies, you referenced potential issues of double counting previous revenue from the nuclear waste fee that has been collected over the previous 30 years. For clarification, if Congress were to appropriate funding from the Nuclear Waste Fund on activities for which it was collected under our scoring rules, Congress, I guess my question is, would Congress be increasing the federal deficit?
Right. If next year Congress were to appropriate $100 million from the Nuclear Waste Fund, that would add to the deficit in that year.
Mr. Bearden, would you agree?
Well, certainly I would agree with CBO and how they would score any impacts on the deficit if funding were appropriated out of the Nuclear Waste Fund within the discretionary spending caps. It would be part of that discretionary spending total and the effects that it would have on the deficit.
What exactly then is accounted for in the Nuclear Waste Fund audit released this morning by the Department of Energy Inspector General?
I'm not quite sure I understand your question. What is accounted for?
Yeah, obviously the audit was released today. So what are they accounting for in the release of that audit in their numbers?
Well, their numbers are reflecting what is the total balance of investments, which are the nuclear utility fee collections, and the interest combined that's available for discretionary appropriation, that $34.3 billion figure by the end of fiscal year 2015. How Congress can use that money and the amounts each year are going to spend on the priorities when discretionary spending caps.
Great. Let me just finish up with Mr. Cavullo. NARUC's previous testimony suggested that Congress could structure payments from the utilities into an escrow account, which would not be provided to the federal government until funding is appropriated by Congress. Please describe how this would protect the ratepayers.
So in the other witnesses' testimony, Mr. Chairman, you heard examples of funds that work in the way this one does. It's NARUC's testimony that this budget approach for something like the disposal of nuclear waste really doesn't make sense when you're talking about a life cycle of many, many decades, possibly in excess of a century. It shouldn't be subject to annual appropriation decisions by Congress. The idea of an escrow account would be to maintain congressional oversight and authority over spending, even while making clear that the funding went into a fund available, for instance, by an independent body charged with oversight exclusively of used waste disposal. There are other examples of funds that are similar to this. The Universal Service Fund that USAC administers is similar, a special purpose fund that is subject to congressional oversight, but which is not subject to an annual appropriation.
Great, thanks. My time's expired. I'm just going to end by saying mandatory receipts, discretionary spending with possible deficit implications. That's why it's very confusing for us. And I recognize Mr. Tonko for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Cawley, you call the Nuclear Waste Fund an accounting mechanism. Is it a trust fund as we think of trust funds in a traditional sense?
It's categorized in the budget as a special fund. Like other funds in the federal budget, they are used to account for monies. The Treasury manages all of the cash on a unified basis. So when we want to spend money that has accumulated in these funds, that requires new spending.
Let me ask this then. The funding collected has already been used to offset past federal deficits. So moving forward, that money would need to be appropriated as discretionary funding from the current fiscal year at that time?
That's right.
I have that right?
Yes.
Okay. So from CBO's perspective, despite the collection of fees in the past, would a change in the law that would allow the waste disposal process to resume, score, and score significantly?
I guess I'm not sure what the change in the law would be, but in the simplest terms, allowing the waste program to go forward could be just the appropriation of X million dollars, and that would be costed along with all other discretionary appropriations in that year, presumably under the cap that controls all discretionary appropriations in that year.
And Mr. Bearden, are there other programs that use this accounting mechanism that are being appropriated discretionary funding annually based on a user fee paid to the Treasury?
Yes, some of the examples that I provided in my testimony with the Superfund Trust Fund, Leaking Underground Storage Tank Trust Fund, Uranium Enrichment, Decontamination, Decommissioning Fund. Those are others.
Have these funds been as troubled with their accounting mechanism?
Well, each of them has had their own set of issues and viewpoints. For example, Leaking Underground Storage Tank Trust Fund, the receipts accumulated at a faster pace than Congress appropriated in the discretionary process, leading to a higher balance than money's going out. That's an example of an issue with that particular fund that has dedicated receipts, but the use of it's subject to discretionary appropriations.
Thank you. Let me toss out a hypothetical, and it would include either this or a future administration reevaluating Yucca Mountain, or Congress changing the law about the location of a permanent geologic repository or the uses of nuclear waste fund fees. Do you believe the Secretary of Energy, under existing authorities, could begin reassessing fees, which have been stopped since May of 2014?
We think the fees could conceivably be charged again under administrative changes, absent a change in law. The court found, in our view, that DOE had not done a fee adequacy study correctly because it couldn't demonstrate if these fees were sufficient to pay the life cycle costs. Presumably, that study could be redone in a different way and demonstrate to the court that these fees either are sufficient or are insufficient to pay for the life cycle costs of the program. In the original act, DOE has the authority to administratively change the fee, present that proposed change to the Congress, and if Congress doesn't act, the fee change goes forward.
Mm-hmm. And are there concerns with the existing contracts with utilities that might might make this more difficult?
Might make a change to the fee difficult, or
Or the assessing of the fees? Or
I can't think of any. No.
okay. And Mr. Bearden, can you explain the process for changing this fee? There's analysis by the Secretary of Energy to determine the appropriate fee, but then it must be submitted to Congress, I believe, for adjustment? Is that?
Yes, for review. Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Yes, I mean, there's a process of a review for that.
Thank you. And Mr. Kambola, the industry estimates $50 billion in damages for utilities with DOE contracts. DOE's total liability estimate is $29 billion. Can you explain this discrepancy?
Mr. Congressman, I really cannot speak for the industry on this point. I do know that DOE had suggested a number, I believe that was nearly $20 billion in size. I'm not sure of the $9 billion exposure, but it is true what you've said in my testimony. There's a citation to an industry estimate of about $50 billion. I think the bottom line here is that there is a large amount of exposure, and whatever the ultimate liability may be, there's a collection of $750 million annually with a lot of unresolved claims that are still pending.
Thank you. My time is up, so I yield back.
I thank my colleague and friend, and I turn to Congressman Johnson from Ohio for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today. Mr. Bearden, in addition to finding a disposal pathway for commercial spent nuclear fuel, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act required a determination regarding the management of the nuclear waste from atomic defense activities. What was the anticipated disposal path for that material?
Well, there are possible pathways of disposal for that material, including a separate repository or a consolidated repository. And the administration had issued its finding of moving forward with planning for a separate repository for defense waste, if that's what you're referring to.
Okay, so what would it mean for defense accounts if we choose to pursue an entirely new disposal pathway for this type of material?
Well, any disposal facility for defense nuclear waste would be subject to appropriation by Congress to have the resources available for certain.
Okay, Mr. Cawley, would that funding be subject to the current caps on defense spending under the Budget Control Act and therefore compete with other defense account activities as well?
Sounds like it would, yes.
I'm sorry?
It sounds like it would, yes.
Okay, all right. You know, the Department of Energy recently found that its estimated liabilities for failure to accept commercial spent nuclear fuel is over $23 billion. That's an annual increase over $1 billion. This estimate, of course, is predicated on achieving the department's strategy on used fuel management and their ability to begin accepting title to stranded spent nuclear fuel in 5 years. So, Mr. Cawley and Mr. Bearden, will you describe how the development and operation of a pilot interim storage, as the administration proposes, would impact the overall estimated liability? And you can choose who goes first, I don't care.
I've heard the department's estimate of their liability of some $24 billion described as depending on their implementation of their strategy, which would have a storage facility during the next 10 years.
So it's safe to say that it's significant.
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Bearden, do you have a comment on that?
Well, as with any strategy, any administration, it would depend ultimately on implementation and the assumptions that they would be made for that to result in the outcomes that they're estimating. And certainly that involves a lot of complexities, and CRS would be happy to work with the committee to discuss those issues and challenges with you at your convenience.
Okay.
And
what portion of DOE's projected liability is tied to only the dozen sites that are completely decommissioned, absent removal of the spent nuclear fuel? Either of you, do you want to comment on that?
I don't have a specific answer to that question, but I do know that under the original contracts, at this point, DOE was to have removed approximately 40,000 metric tons of waste out of the some 72,000 metric tons of waste that exists. It doesn't address specifically the spent fuel at the facilities that have closed. Some of that, no doubt, should have been removed by this time.
Can you take that question for the record, please, and do some research on that and get back to us? Okay, thank you. Mr. Bearden, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act included a number of provisions to provide financial assistance to state, affected local, and tribal governments. Will you please describe what this funding was intended to support?
Well, there's a range of funding authorized, subject to appropriation from the Nuclear Waste Fund for affected units of local government, states and tribes. Some of that is for oversight during the licensing process and other assistance, and some of the totals of that have been approximately $520 million, at least to the end of fiscal year 2009 that I'm familiar with. And so that assistance in part is to go for their oversight in the licensing process.
Are you aware of how much funding has previously been directed to the state of Nevada and local and tribal governments?
I do not have that figure with me today, but I'd be happy to provide that as a follow-up response for the record.
Mr. Kavula, your organization is on record supporting reasonable economic benefits and incentives for host states and communities. Would you like to discuss very briefly, because my time has expired, the nature of those benefits and the role of federal-state partnerships?
Congressman, I'd be happy to follow up in more detail, but briefly, we acknowledge that this is a liability for a state to take on. We agree that there needs to be some concessions made for units of local government to take them on, but those need to be tied to, frankly, the scope of the responsibilities they're shouldering, and not, I think, just a giveaway that would ultimately be placed on the consuming rate-paying public.
Okay, my time has expired. Would you provide an expanded answer to that?
I'd be happy to.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Would now recognize Mr. Green from Texas for 5 minutes.
Chairman, I'm trying to get used to this Ways and Means committee room. Do you think we could take some of our jurisdiction when we leave that they took from us over the years? But anyway, I want to welcome our colleagues and from the agencies. The success of our nation's nuclear waste management program is dependent on making fees raised from the Nuclear Waste Fund available as needed for construction, transportation, and storage of high-level nuclear waste. This is not the case currently, and congressional action after the enactment of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act has sharply limited the ability of responsible agencies to access the funds to study, construct a storage facility, be it interim or permanent. As a committee of jurisdiction, we must begin the process of fixing this broken system, uphold the federal government's contractual obligations to the ratepayers, and ensure a clear path for the prompt licensing and construction of permanent storage facilities. Mr. Cawley, what is the current amount of the money in the Nuclear Waste Fund?
Current balance is shown on the table 1 in my prepared testimony. It's about $34 billion.
Pardon, 84?
34.
34 million or billion?
Billion.
Billion, okay. How much of the money has the federal government currently paid in damages to the electric utilities for failing to take the title of the civilian nuclear waste by the required date?
So far, we've paid approximately $5.3 billion. In the coming decade, we expect there'll be about $5 billion more.
Okay. You noted in your testimony that several utilities have not paid their one-time fee into the Nuclear Waste Fund. Does CBO know how much these outstanding one-time fees are valued at?
One-time fees currently have a value of about $1.6 billion.
Okay. Is the Department of Energy currently doing anything to collect those outstanding fees from the utilities?
The one-time fees was an option given to utilities back at the beginning of the Act, and they are due when their first delivery of waste to a repository is made.
Mr. Kavula, is our nation's current system for high-level nuclear waste working for the people of your state?
Well, Congressman, no. Montana has no nuclear waste and shouldn't be paying, frankly, for any of this. And the irony of the federal policy is that through the damages awarded against DOE, even taxpayers of those states who have no connection with nuclear-generated electricity are nonetheless paying for this problem.
Well, as a supporter of nuclear energy and expansion, and coming from Texas, where we're trying to look at a mid-level waste facility in West Texas, obviously we need, and if you want nuclear power, we have to have some place, whether it be the temporary storage on site, the interim storage, or ultimately the long-term storage. But I can't say we have the solution, because there's no country in the world that has long-term storage. France, who generates a great deal of their electricity from nuclear. Sweden actually has a big hole in the ground, but I asked how they afforded that, and they said, well, what they would call their local jurisdiction, it was a prototype, but they agreed they would never put anything in there. So, everybody wants their electricity turned on, but we don't know where to put the nuclear waste. Do you believe the ratepayers in Montana and other states represented by NARC have confidence in the federal government and Congress to fix the current system?
Well, I have confidence, I hope, Congressman, that your subcommittee will do something about
I wish I had confidence we would fix it. Mr. Bearden, in the last 50 seconds, how are pay-go requirements created under the enactment of the NWPA impacting the Energy Department's access to funds currently in the Nuclear Waste Fund?
Well, the access to those funds is dependent on the appropriations of the discretionary process. So it's the discretionary spending limits that are affecting the availability of monies that Congress can prioritize each year out of the Nuclear Waste Fund.
Has the Budget Control Act of 2011 limited the federal government's access to the money in the Nuclear Waste Fund?
To the extent that there are caps on overall discretionary spending, that pressure that's on all discretionary spending is also on appropriations that would come from the Nuclear Waste Fund.
If Congress were to create a single-purpose independent corporation for nuclear waste storage, how would Congress continue to ensure the strong oversight by such an entity?
That would depend on the legislation that sets up agency roles and how that may be overseen and what the nature of that entity is. So it would not be possible to answer that with knowing all those details.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. And just for a point of information, last month, Finland's government became the first to approve construction on such a long-term storage. Finland, a deep underground repository after more than 30 years of efforts to find a suitable site. So maybe someday, Mr. Green, maybe someday. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Mississippi for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to each of you and for your knowledge and expertise on what is overall a very intriguing and challenging issue on how we go forward and what we're going to do. So thank you for your testimony. And this, Mr. Cawley, I'll probably ask you, I'll direct this towards you. When the Department of Energy instituted the nuclear waste fee in the 1980s, it had to account for the cost to dispose of spent nuclear fuel generated prior to the passage of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. And certainly, as you know, they did this by providing utilities the option to pay a one-time fee up front or defer payment. And I know, Mr. Bearden, you've discussed some of these issues on the structure and current value. But Mr. Cawley, with CBO's cash basis scoring process, can you explain how does CBO account for this one-time fee that is yet to be collected?
So the one-time fee with the current value of approximately $1.6 billion is due upon delivery of the first amount of waste from the couple utilities that chose that option. It hasn't affected the deficits in the past. It will affect deficits in the future if we receive that money. We don't really have an outlook for receiving that money, certainly in the next couple of years.
Gotcha. You know, as we've heard in some of today's testimony, when Congress appropriates funding by using the Nuclear Waste Fund authorization, you know, it does not result in an overall increase in the amount of discretionary spending. And Mr. Cawley, does it make a difference for CBO scoring purposes whether or not the appropriation from the Nuclear Waste Fund, regardless of the specific nuclear waste management activity?
I'm not sure I got the question, but
Well, let me just ask this. This concept, would that concept apply for CBO's scoring of activities to support consolidated interim storage?
if work on a consolidated interim storage were authorized and there were an appropriation out of the waste fund for that or out of the general fund for that, that would be scored as additional discretionary spending. And again, presumably that spending would come under current caps.
The gentleman yield.
Yes.
But the authority to spend discretionary dollars in an interim plan would take a change in the current law.
That's my understanding.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Cawley, therefore, is it correct that proposed legislation to authorize the development of a consolidated interim storage proposal would potentially be treated the same whether or not the activities are authorized to be supported from the Nuclear Waste Fund?
I mean, general fund spending versus an appropriation out of the nuclear waste fund, they both cost, yes.
Okay. Mr. Kavula, if I could ask you this. Your testimony calls for the establishment of an independent body to manage nuclear waste disposal. If Congress cedes its authority under the appropriations process, how can Congress maintain control over such an entity to assure it's fulfilling its legal obligations intended under the law and in the taxpayer interest?
Congressman, let me answer the question this way. Under the appropriations process currently, you have oversight jurisdiction over the DOE and the NRC, and your jurisdiction has been flouted, candidly. I think NARUC's recommendation is to establish not only oversight of whatever appropriation you escrow or give under the control of such a body, but also positive timelines and steps to that body so that you're not essentially ruling by the power of the purse through negations of agency acts, but directing an agency, this new independent body, to do specific things that are enforceable by entities like NARUC and courts of law so that no administration in the future can again act to drag its feet on this important question.
Thanks to each of you. My time's almost expired, so I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time actually returns the balance of his time. Seeing no other members and knowing that people have other places to go, we want to thank you for your time, and the record will be open for a couple days. Should other members want to submit, we'd ask that you would turn those in a timely manner. And thank you again for your time. With that, I'll adjourn the hearing.